Hi, my name is Kalia Young. I'm known as the Identity Woman, and I will be sharing with you today key differences between the U.S. Social Security number system and the Indian Aadhaar system, along with exploring the future of self-sovereign identity. I'll get started sharing my slides. So first of all, who am I? Well, I was born in Vancouver, Canada. I started playing water polo for many years ago when I was 10 years old, and I played for the Canadian national team and at UC Berkeley, where I came to the United States. I was very active in the Planet Work Network, which we'll cover a little bit later. Joined the first Identity Commons as a communicator and evangelist about the network they were building. I started my Identity Woman blog in 2005. I co-founded the Internet Identity Workshop also in that year, 2005, and still run it to this day. I founded the Personal Data Ecosystem in 2010. I earned a Master of Science in Identity Management and Security in 2017. Wrote the Comprehensive Guide to Self-Sovereign Identity in 2018. And I traveled to India to study the Aadhaar system last winter in 2019. And just this summer, the Domains of Identity that I wrote originally as part of my master's program was published by Anthem Press. So I've been in the digital identity business for a really long time. The core question at the heart of my work is, how can people represent themselves? How can people represent themselves in cyberspace? And how can they do so across the huge diversity that we have in our lives? And in the early 2000s, we called this user-centric digital identity, and now it's called decentralized or self-sovereign identity. So in the year 2000, Planet Work convened a conference called Global Ecology and Information Technology, and they went on to host a 18-month-long series of conversations called the Link Tank. And out of that, they published something called the Augmented Social Network, Building Identity and Trust into the Next Generation Internet. And it was published actually by an internet journal called First Monday. And they wrote this: underlying this report is the assumption that every individual ought to have the right to control his or her own online identity. You should be able to decide what information about yourself is collected as part of your digital profile, and of that information, who has access to different aspects of it. Certainly, you should be able to share and read the complete contents of your own digital profile at any time. An online identity should be maintained as a capability that gives control to the user gives the user many forms of control. Without flexible access and control, trust in the system of federated network identity will be minimal. A digital profile is not treated by the corporations who host them as a formal extension of the person it represents, but if this crucial data about you is not owned by you, what right do you have to manage its use? A civil society approach to persistent identity is a cornerstone of the Augmented Social Network project. So this was written in 2003, and they were very prescient in sort of understanding the dynamics that could emerge if you didn't have people's ability to control their digital representations themselves. And in fact, they said, if we don't build open standards for digital identity for people, we'll end up in a world where corporations and or governments control our digital representations. And indeed, that's largely where we've ended up, although at the end I'll get to cover SSI, and I think we've really have a lot of potential to actually make the vision really real. So I founded the Internet Identity Workshop in 2005, and here are some slides of us happily whiteboarding and networking, and we are still gathering like this. So you are all invited to IIW 31, which is virtually hosted October 20th to 22nd. Although you may suffer virtual jet lag, you can still attend from where you're based. And lots of open standards and protocols have been born and nested at IIW. This page covers many of them, but there are some more. And it's a very, very vibrant, innovative community. I want to start off by talking about the different topologies of identity that we were dealing with at the time, and they're still predominant on the web today. So one topology of identity is sole source. And this is where you have an account with every separate organization or website that you go to, and you end up with many different usernames and passwords. And you end up with your digital representation of yourself chopped up into a whole bunch of little pieces. It's really a pain in the butt. So you have this other typology that emerged in part out of work that we innovated at IAW with the development of OpenID and OAuth, where you can have an identity provider that supports you logging into a whole bunch of organizations and not having to get yet another account at each one of them, but just reuse an account that you already have. Except when we do this, we end up being reliant on a bunch of large companies, and our digital representations are in fact controlled by them if we use these services. So it doesn't really get us where to where I envisioned us going with those original questions. We also have a public sector identity provider model. And so this is what has been happens when you have a conventional state issuing a digital identity, an identity provider model of digital ID. So it's what you have with Estonia's X-Road, India's Aadhaar, and to some extent the European eIDAS middleware, which sort of allows Europeans to take an ID from one government and use it at other ones. So it does the same thing. It puts whoever developed or became the identity provider, the state, in the middle of all the transactions you might use the digital identity for. And that's problematic. But wait, I just said conventional state-issued ID. What's that? It's its whole separate kettle of fish. And in fact, this domain, the domain of government registration, dates back to birth certificates from the 1500s in the United Kingdom. In the United States, they only had universal birth registration really in the 1940s. And today, many countries still don't have universal birth registration. There are 1 billion people who don't have government-issued ID. You also have governments doing censuses, and the receipts that people received for participation and being logged in the census became a form of ID. Colonizers registered colonial subjects, and this is a really critical piece of history about these systems that's often forgotten. I highly recommend Keith Breckenridge's The Biometric State, The Global Politics of Identification and Surveillance in South Africa from 1850 to the Present. And in India, in particular, the post-colonial context where Tarangani wrote In Pursuit of Proof, A History of Identity Documents in India. Then we have the precursors to passports, which took the form of letters of introduction and safe travel from the 15th century to the 13th century to the 15th century in Europe. Modern identity ID credentials from the 18th, 19th century and the 20th century. So here we can see some of that evolution. And the first passports were issued in the 1910s in Europe around World War I. And passport standardization really got going with ICAO over several decades and really solidified by 1980, which is very, very recently. And the best resource I know about for this history is Mawaki Chongo's PhD thesis, Becoming Artifacts, Medieval Seals, Passports, and the Future of Digital Identity. I want to touch on one thing before we keep going, and that is this assertion that there are 1 billion people that don't have government-issued ID, and the World Bank Identity for Development program has put a lot of emphasis on this, and I want to be really clear about what it is emphasizing. It's focused on digital or digitized foundational ID systems. And my summary of this is really that the database of citizens registered is digitized, that each resident is a line in the database. That is really their primary focus and concern. It is not about how individuals are empowered with their digital ID and how they choose to represent themselves digitally. To be very explicit, it does not discuss many other types of digital ID systems, such as those provided by the private sector for customers, authentication, i.e. logins for email accounts or social media, or refer to the broader notion of who you are on the internet. The term digital ID in their documents, the World documents, is used synonymously with digital/digitized foundational ID systems. This is really important to call out because of the distinction that needs to be made between autonomous human beings figuring out how to represent themselves digitally and states recording and digitizing their citizens. They're really different projects, but they use a lot of the same language, so it gets confusing. So I'm going to cover a lot of my research that I did in India. My original research plan was to meet with a broad range of stakeholders and work with them to create a value network maps of the Aadhaar system. And there are 3 elements to each map. Nodes represent real people or a contributing role they play in the activity. The directional arrows communicate a single transaction moving from one role to another, and transactions with intangible deliverables are shown here in the dashed line, and transactions with tangible deliverables are shown with a solid line. But while I was in India, I heard a constant comparison between the Aadhaar and the US Social Security number system. And something didn't seem quite right about these comparisons. They often didn't understand how the SSN actually worked in the United States. Both the Aadhaar numbers and the Social Security numbers are unique numbers issued by residents by a central federal government and mailed to the citizen. But the comparison breaks down quickly beyond that. The overall system and design of Aadhaar and the vision for the connections across a vast array of systems, both in the private and public sector, goes well beyond the role of the SSN in American life. So this is my research result: key differences between the US Social Security system and India's Aadhaar system. So let me introduce you to the US Social Security number. It was introduced in 1935 in the middle of the Great Depression to support tracking pension contributions over a lifetime and the distribution of pensions in retirement. It was at the time only issued to a small segment of citizens, and it was administered through the post office, where people would go to the post office, fill out a form, and they would get assigned the number right there. The system has evolved over the last 85 years, and now numbers are issued to children at birth. And there's several different resources to go look at this history, and it's worth examining. Today, Social Security numbers are used in very narrow context. They're used by employers to verify employment eligibility and by the government to track the collection of taxes, social benefit contributions, and to support them receiving benefits. Most residents also have a state driver's license or ID card that an SSN is required in the application process, and this type of ID, this photo ID issued by the state, is held by 87% of adults. Identifier-oriented systems like the SSN originated at a time when paper-based punch cards were the latest technology, and there were limits on how far and wide a number could circulate when paper technologies like punch cards, index cards, and the physical mail systems were the only means of circulation. And this is really critical because the difference now between the paper-based system and digital systems means we have to think differently about how we design these systems and not just rely on the paper-based models that break down. In the United States, public concern about the possible use of the SSN for government surveillance has limited the use of the number and led to regulations about its use, both public and private sector, and we'll cover many of those. In 1965, there was a proposal to create a national data center that would pool statistical information held by the Census Bureau, the Internal Revenue Service, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Social Security Administration, the Federal Reserve Board, as well as dozens of other federal agencies. Public reaction to merging of these bureaucratic records caught proponents off guard because they thought the composite data were necessary for a well-ordered society, and the benefits were self-evident. But the reaction by the public was hostile and sustained when the proposal was floated in 1967 and again in 1970 when it was finally rejected. There was widespread press coverage that looked into the implications for the present and future of creating such databases, and here's two examples of magazine covers from the time covering this issue. The U.S. government agency, both as a matter of policy and law, are reducing or ending reliance on the Social Security number as the canonical identifier for people. There is no way an SSN can be used for authentication against a factor of authentication like a password, OTP, or biometric held by the Social Security Administration. Really, all they have is your name and an associated number with it, and not even a biometric. It's very difficult to imagine a proposal by private sector companies or government leaders in the United States that would require individuals to log in with an SSN. There's ongoing work in the United States to develop ways for individuals to prove they're a particular person by leveraging government-issued identity documents in digital form. Self-sovereign identity technologies are being funded and piloted by the U.S. government currently, and an important feature of these systems is that they do not rely on a connection to a central government database to prove their veracity. Now let me introduce you to the Aadhaar system. So Nandan Nilekani was a charismatic leader. I guess he still is. He was named as a cabinet member, but was not elected to parliament. And he started the Unique Identity Authority of India. And it had an intense startup culture that was really different from the conventional Indian bureaucracy, which is partly why it succeeded. It created a minimum viable ID of name, birthday, gender, and address, along with biometrics, a photo, 2 iris scans, 10 fingerprints. And also on the form was a request for the phone number, email address, and bank account information. This is what the form looked like. And this is somebody being enrolled. So people enrolled, the enrollment process happened locally, and the information was sent to the central identity repository. There was a check for uniqueness, and a unique number was issued. And then that number was sent out to the resident in a card with 0 security features. Here's an example of a value network map that I drew to articulate this whole process and all of the actors in it. And this is different, sort of talking about the same process diagram developed by the UIDAI that they developed to communicate this process, right? And a core piece of this is a state registrar, a state level government that was key to collecting information, both at the state level and the national level. In the United States, the process of getting a social security number happens with enrollment at birth and is done entirely by federal government officials at the county, which is like below the state and federal level. The forms that a mother fills out to register births in hospital include forms that go via the county registrar to the Social Security Administration, and they in turn send a card to the mothers with the Social Security number of their infants. And there is no private sector involvement driving the enrollment process. It's just part of the paperwork of having a child. And so I want to highlight, this is the comparisons with the US Social Security number system are coming from the creators of the UIDAI itself. The same thing happens at Nandanelli in the 1930s in the United States when Roosevelt passed the Social Security Act as part of the Green New Deal. And because the US is often admired as a large functioning democracy, the fact that it uses a national ID number means that there's an assumption that the US system must be a good model. But this is where I bring up the question, like, hey, but how does the US system work? And this is what we're going to dive into and compare the two systems back and forth. So the US Social Security Act of 1935 was passed before any part of the system was worked. It was built, meaning it was anchored in the law from the very beginning and grounded in a government administration governed by those laws. The UIDAI did not have a legal or regulatory basis for 6 years between 2009 and 2016, and it operated with a startup culture. There is several books that I read on my in my research, and both the key main books that cover this history describe UIDAI leaders as keen to build out Aadhaar despite this legal limbo. The Social Security number is not a card and is not an ID card. In fact, it says so on it that it is not for identification. And state level cards do have security features on them. That means that you can have more confidence that the photo on them is actually the person who is represented by it. In India, the card that's issued has no security features at all. It's just a plain piece of paper. The Social Security card in the US is not shared in photocopies across everyday life. And I saw this in India where the photocopying of Aadhaar cards was happening in a vast array of places, but that just does not happen in the United States. The SSN card is not used to get into airports. However, some places you might see being asked for an ID, you could use a state level card that have photos and security features. So what happens often is people present their card with no security features on it, and there is no authentication happening to match biometrically the person who's presenting the card and with their actual information. So it's a lot of sort of security theater or card presentation theater. In the United States, there's no way to use an SSN to log into government services. In India, individuals who have a unique ID can log into services and either use a biometric or a one-time password sent to their phone in which they enter to complete remote authentication. And what this means, this type of transaction, is that the UIDAI has a record of all the places where a person authenticates their identity, and this information is kept in Aadhaar's logs for 6 months. Originally, there was a plan to keep this information for 7 years. So the SSN has no phone number associated with it. So there is no one-time password authentication via text SMS capability. And it's just impossible. In India, when people do use this one-time password sent via SMS for authentication, there's some really serious problems because many people do not have their own separate phone number. In lots of remote villages, the headman has a phone, and almost everyone in the villages uses that phone number as the one they listed on their Aadhaar application. So that person is then intermediating everybody's potential use of these OTPs. And on top of this, in the United States, there's a standard called NIST 800-633 Identity and Security Standards that has deprecated the use of authentication via mobile SMS because it is fundamentally insecure. So it's problematic that the Aadhaar system is leveraging mobile SMS so heavily for authentication when it is fundamentally insecure. There are 5 different ways you can do authentication with Aadhaar, and as I said, this is impossible mostly with the US Social Security numbers. There is a very limited private sector ability to do authentication of SSN holders. Only employers can check if an SSN is valid for a new prospective employer. So they have an API that employers can apply to use, and they can access it by sharing a name and a social security number and get back a yes/no answer if it's valid for work. In India, there is eKYC flow that has been set up between individuals showing up at private sector institutions, and they themselves using their Aadhaar number to prove who they are and have the UIDAI send back information to the institution that they're doing an eKYC with, whether it's a bank or with a phone company. The SSN is not used as a bank routing number. Definitely not. So there is no way to send benefits via the Social Security number. All people who are receiving benefits from the US government via direct transfer go to the Social Security Administration and give them the information about their bank account so that the benefits can be sent to them. These are more value network maps of different systems that are in place. And this is a diagram coming from the Unified Payments Interface folks. The Social Security Administration does not share data from its database with state-level governments. This is really, really important. It just doesn't. There is no connection between these databases. UIDAI was set up and it fed information directly into state resident data hubs as part of the enrollment process. This is a diagram that I found during my research that really articulates what's going on. The state, they collected 2 types of information: the Know Your Resident, which was the core information required by Aadhaar, and some states had additional information that they asked for along with biometrics. And the enrollment process, the registrar sent the Know Your Resident information and biometrics to the central UIDAI authority at the top, and also sent the Know Your Resident and Know Your Resident Plus information to the state resident data hub. And it linked the enrollment ID that was issued to residents in the registration process with the eventual unique identification number. This is another diagram that I found in my research, really documenting at a really high level, sort of like infographic for a magazine, how the first step is enrollment with the state, and then the second part is going to the state registrar, and then how the information travels to UIDAI and the state resident data hub, and that the state resident data hub is connecting all these government databases. Here's another diagram I also found in my research where the Aadhaar enrollment data is owned by UIDAI. It shared data that was collected with the state resident data hubs, And then the state resident data hubs were being used to integrate and synchronize and cleanse all these other databases of different benefits programs and other services. Here's some diagrams from Andhra Pradesh, and they are talking about how to build a people hub. That's their term for the state resident data hub. And here we're saying some of the language that's come up where you have a golden record. And we'll talk about that in a moment and how it can be really problematic. The SSN is not pushed into databases linking people's records in Social service delivery without their awareness or consent. This is really critical. We'll learn a little bit more about the various laws that were passed to make this really true, but there is no merging and collecting data about U.S. citizens that they don't understand and know about. In India, there was extensive, what they called inorganic seeding to link database records. And this causes problems with people who use different names or different spellings. All the different languages in India being transliterated into English for these databases. It's a very imperfect system that led to some people being excluded. The assumption was that only those matching the UID Aadhaar numbers were real beneficiaries and everyone else was a ghost or fake and could be eliminated. This strategy to address who is on different social service programs is causing disruption to clients who have had their benefits cut off because they have legitimate claims that are not recognized by the system. The state resident data hubs have applied a computer science data modeling idea of a single source of truth and sought to impose it on Indian society and bureaucracy, deciding whatever is recorded in the UIDAI database is a single source of truth about an individual. So in the United States, rather than creating mass databases and integrating all the data about citizens across contexts, the U.S. government is actively taking steps to stop and reduce the use of the Social Security number, even in unlinked discrete databases. The current use of the number at the federal level is mandated only for a few agencies and services, such as the Internal Revenue Service, Tax Authority, Social Security Administration, passport applications, and for loans by any federal agency. Other agencies that request the number must inform residents that sharing it is voluntary, and they will not be denied services if they do not share the number. The use of USSNs across agencies regulated and data sharing between agencies about people is prohibited. So the census data that we're in a census year now, that data is never released or shared across agencies, and the actual data from the census is only released 75 years after it's collected. While I was in India, folks told me about the government of Telangana and shared some of what it has been doing with really intensive surveys. I took some excerpts here, all sorts of really detailed information, and then compiling it together in their state resident data hubs and creating maps that were accessible by government workers in the field with just incredibly detailed information. This type of information would just not be acceptable culturally in the United States for government agencies to be collecting, aggregating, and then providing to government agents. So this was all in the name of creating really detailed information about people and these people hubs, and framed as a good thing. In the United States, there are some very limited multi-context enrollments. So legislation was put in place, colloquially known as the Motor Voter Act, in 1993 that mandates that states provide the opportunity for people who are signing up or reviewing a driver's license to also have the opportunity to vote in elections. So individuals get driver's license must proactively choose to be enrolled in the second and very different system. The special process pushes data from the driver's license registration process over to the government agencies that manage the state level voter list. And this is one of the very few places where you have information moving between systems, and it's at the explicit request of the citizen. The Social Security Administration has a deliberate culture and a mandate to operate within the laws passed by Congress. And for decades, there have been extensive on-the-record hearings by various legislative committees and presidential commissions addressing government systems for registering citizens and collecting and using data about them. And hearings of this type in India are by default not public in the Indian parliamentary system. I learned this from some of my fellows in the New America India U.S. Public Interest Technology Fellowship. It was a really great community. The other thing that I learned about, or I knew about the U.S. system, is that privacy impact assessments are required for all new databases about people. You just cannot build a database in the U.S. government without writing a privacy impact assessment and publishing its existence in something called the Federal Register. The UIDI had a startup culture, and we could summarize this with Facebook's motto, move fast and break things. UIDI did not do privacy impact assessments or security assessments that would have brought transparency into the system, into how the system would work, or change work in an ongoing way, and also like looking at what future implications could be. In my interviews with UIDAI leaders, they described the next new features they were going to be appearing within the India Stack framework, and while at the same time saying that UIDAI had no responsibility for how people were asked for their identity information or what information was being used by how the information was being used by those who were requesting it. The U.S. Social Security Administration is not a self-regulating entity. It is directly responsible to Congress and the oversight that is embedded in the legislation around it. The Aadhaar Act of 2016, the UIDAI was left as its own regulator and with enormous freedom to expand aspects of the system that would build new features without the need to consult the public. And part of the reason for this apparent allowance for self-regulation is that in India, most legislation is written in a way that delegates significant regulatory power to the government, while the law concentrates on legal and policy issues. In the case of the Aadhaar Act, substantial regulatory power was not given to the government, but to the UIDAI itself, meaning it is not actually accountable to any other organization. And the UIDAI is exempt from right for information requests, and it sets the grievance mechanisms for itself. The UIDAI is responsible for regulating the ecosystem around it, and many have questions the revolving door that is seemingly connecting the UIDAI and private industry. And the question is whether this limits the ability of UIDAI to regulate its own ecosystem. In the United States, challenges to U.S. government procedures happen in the courts, where proceedings produce court transcripts. And in the 38 days of hearings about Aadhaar before the Indian Supreme Court, they produced no transcripts. The best we have are summaries and aggregations of live tweeting done by observers in the courtroom. Another thing that I learned about, and as I met with people who experienced this themselves, many of them actually, is that reporters, security researchers, and NGOs who point out flaws in the system are being subject to first incident reports or criminal investigations initiated by the UIDAI and carried out by their local police departments. So this is a really clear suppression of dissent and speech around this system. So I want to ask this question: how did the United States move from a public outcry against a national data center to developing actual laws and regulation that help citizens accept the same data being collected by discrete agencies to guard against information sharing between agencies? So what was the big shift? Because the U.S. was starting to use the Social Security number along for more and more purposes with more and more agencies. And one of the things that happened, there was a very active and free press. There was a lively debate about these systems and their impact and how the coming computerization would affect how they worked and how they might impact people if there was no regulation. So here's a sampling of magazine articles and major books that came out at the time looking at these issues. And all of this happened before I was born. In this time period, the late 60s and early 70s, there were multiple hearings, task forces, and committees convened by various agencies of the federal government and committees in the U.S. Congress. And here are just a few of them. The the Social Security Number Task Force in 1970, the 1973, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare Advisory Committee on Automated Personal Data Systems issued a report called Records, Computers, and the Rights of Citizens. This committee developed a code of fair information practices that inspired by the Code of Fair Labor Practices. And here's the formulation of the code. Safeguards for personal privacy based on our concept of mutuality in record keeping would require adherence by record keeping organizations to certain fundamental principles of fair information practice. There must be no personal data record keeping systems whose very existence is secret. There must be a way for an individual to find out what information about him is in a record and how it is used. There must be a way for an individual to prevent information about him obtained for one purpose being used or made available for other purposes without his consent. There must be a way for an individual to correct or amend a record of identifiable information about himself. And any organization creating, maintaining, using, or disseminating records of identifiable personal data must assure the reliability of the data, and for their intended use, they must make reasonable precautions to prevent misuse of the data. These were the starting points of what evolved to be the Fair Information Practices and Principles and evolved into the Privacy Act of 1974 that prohibits data sharing between government agencies. It also states that no government agency can deny to any individual any right, benefit, or privilege provided by law because of such an individual's refusal to disclose his Social Security account number, except refusal to disclose after a minimum pursuant to the requirements of federal statutes or pursuant to pre-existing federal or state statutes or regulations through which the systems of records had already been set up. So it sort of grandfathered in uses that were prescribed in various statutes up until 1975, but it really laid down the ground and said you cannot deny people services because they refuse to share their Social Security number. There is significant regulation of the use of the SSN by the federal government, state level governments, and by the private sector. In 1976, the Tax Reform Act expanded the use of the SSN outside of federal agencies by offering the direct use of SSN in state and local government programs. In 1977, Personal Privacy in the Information Society and the Privacy Protection Study Commission was delivered to President Carter. It covered the relationships among government agencies and across a broad range of services and had a special chapter on the SSN. The Debt Collections Act of 1982 required that an SSN be collected as part of applications for all federal loans, student, agricultural, small business, each administered by different departments. That's standard practice. And what's really important is these are not merging into one database. They're all separate, but sort of mandating if the government's giving you money, then it can ask for the SSN. It's important to keep in mind that mandating the use of SSN for privacy protection, that each of these departments could not share data about residents with each other without consent. And many government departments that encompassed workforces and programs like the military or Medicare, healthcare for the elderly, that relied heavily on SSN as the identifier. And they made significant changes in their systems and stopped using it altogether. So your military number, like the number that you get when you join the military, is no longer a social security number. And the same is true with the Medicare program, where you have a Medicare number, not just your social security number. I'm going to contrast this with this diagram that is in iSprit slides, where they see the Aadhaar number in many ways like they see an IP address as like a central thing that is used for routing for a huge range of services in Indian society. It's a really contrasting stance in terms of how the number is used and what it means. I wanted to just share this, sort of jammed all the different value network maps together to give you a holistic picture of what I came away from my time in India in terms of understanding how the Aadhaar system works. What I'd really love to do if I had the opportunity to do future research is use a similar model for mapping and look at different national ID systems around the world and how they work. Because I think it could be really informative to understand key differences and key similarities and learn from them. So how do we thread this needle? How do we have governments to provide resident citizens attributes that they're authoritative about without being digitally in the middle of those transactions? And this is where we get to decentralized identity. In the middle, you have a decentralized identifier, a DID. Here is an example of one, and it comes with two numbers, a public key and a private key that you keep in a wallet. And there is a key value pair. You have a decentralized identifier as a key and a JSON LD document describing the entity identified by the DID. There are these standard elements of a DID document: a DID for self-description, a set of public keys for verification, the authentication protocols, a set of authentication protocols for authentication, a set of service endpoints for interaction, and a timestamp for audit history, and a signature for integrity. This is what it looks like. This is a real DID document with the ID, the public keys, the authentication signature types, the service endpoint, when it was created, updated, and the signature. So some of these decentralized identifiers go on ledgers, and there are each DID method defines the syntax, the key elements for that particular DID, and how you create, read, update, and delete it. There are many active DID method specs, and you can find them in the method registry at the W3C Credential Community Group. There's also work happening on a universal resolver. And some of these DIDs really are only between relying parties. So pairwise, agent-to-agent encrypted messaging. And here's a super simple diagram of two agents, and they use either DID communications or the CHAPI protocol to connect and share information. And I've also included information about these emerging tools. Now I have to ask this question: who cares about really long numbers? Because they're not that interesting by themselves, and they get really interesting when you add verifiable credentials. So we have this problem. We've talked about it already. Paper documents are really easy to forge, and it's really challenging for those receiving them to know whether they're valid or not. And so the other problem is that centralized identity provider models that phone home to the government to ask whether a person's information is correct or not create a massive privacy problem. And to address this, we have sort of a new paradigm of how to exchange information using decentralized identifiers as an anchor and using new tools. So wallet software that acts on behalf of the user. Individuals have a private ledger that they can post their own DID documents to, and they can share a DID with an issuer, formerly known as a identity provider, who challenges them to see if they're really in control of the private keys associated with the DID. And then the issuer also does something. They post their own DID document onto a ledger so it's easily lookupable along with their public keys. And the issuer now takes the DID from the individual and uses it as an anchor for a verifiable credential that they can package up and hand over to the individual. This is a verifiable credential and has a standard format, and it's really a universal language for any institution or person to say anything about another one. The verified is more about the cryptography than who did it. And it could be everything from like your actual ID from the government to like, I went to yoga class yesterday, or I bought a refrigerator. It's from the very mundane to the totally serious. It's just a data format. So it has a credential identifier, the claims associated with it, credential metadata, and the issuer signature. So once the individual has their credential in their wallet, say I graduated from university, and now they can use that to share it with a potential employer. And the potential employer does two things. They check that they actually control the decentralized identifier, and they check the DID document of the issuer to see that it is valid, that the credential wasn't tampered and it really came from them. So what's different is like the verifier and the issuer, they do not talk, right? There is no direct technical connection between the two. And this is a huge breakthrough. It has the potential to end username and password, and we'll see another slide later that says another thing, which is infinitely scalable, low-cost federation. I want to share one more project to help ground this in reality and show the potential that it has. And this is the Verifiable Organizations Network, because these credentials can apply to businesses and not just people. And I think this is also one of the things that makes it really powerful, is it has the potential to sort of bootstrap more complex economic networks and systems than just getting a national ID and trying to jam everything through it. So in this example, we have Mary's Bakery, and she needs lots of documents that are a bit cumbersome to go and collect. I have, back when I was in college, I read a book about where they talked about the permit Raj in India. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, but you know, there's a role for making sure that restaurants have met their health requirements and other things. So Mary has to get a bunch of documents to open her bakery, and she has to engage with a bunch of different agencies, and it's a burden. But what if the business could provide verifiable proof about its qualifications when transacting online, if it could use the verifiable credentials we just described? That it could be issued a certificate, that she could share the certificate, and the certificate could be verified by the bank or institutions. So a credential definition is created and published on the ledger, and the issuers issue these credentials to Mary, who is the holder of them because she's the owner of the business, and the verifiers can go look them up in what they call an identifier registry. So this is a ledger that's storing DIDs and DID documents of issuers. All of what I've shared with you is like good, but there's a chicken and egg dilemma. How do we kickstart one side of the market and get things going? So business information is public information. It's all in public databases, and they decided to pull it all together into one big database called the org book, and this is live and running, and you can go look it up. And digitally signed and sealed verifiable credentials of all the businesses in the province. And what it also means is that when Mary the baker finally goes, oh my gosh, I want the verifiable credentials for my business, she can go to the org book, prove who she is as the owner of the business, and get that information. So she can now use these decentralized credentials to open up accounts. In fact, the Canadian government is a relying party. If you want to get a contract with the Canadian federal government and you're based in British Columbia, you must present the verifiable credentials for your business, proving the business name. So this creates the opportunity for infinitely scalable, low-cost federation. And I think it has a lot of promise. I wanted to also name one more project that is happening. The US federal government is actually funding the development of these technologies through the Silicon Valley Innovation Program led by Anil John. And one of the use cases that they're working on is having one government agency, the department that issues green cards to US residents, issue digital versions of those green cards, and then have another agency, the Transportation Security Administration, the folks who check your ID at the airport before you get on an airplane, be able to accept those digital credentials for boarding or for crossing those security checkpoints. And this all happens without one agency's plugging into the other one. The credentials are really in control of the individuals. And the Canadians have also been doing a lot of work. British Columbia is there, but also at the federal level, there's been work on a pan-Canadian trust framework, because one of the issues with these credentials is how do you believe them? How do you know what's in them? And in fact, Sunil Abraham has written this paper that just came out that I'd recommend, which is called Building Trust, Lessons from Canada's Approach to Digital Identity. Much like my paper with comparing the US Social Security number system to Aadhaar, this paper draws on Canada's experience building these trust frameworks and compares it with the Indian experience of rushing to build the Aadhaar system. I finally want to conclude by saying I only talked about one side of two sides of these interconnected systems, which is just the identity side, and that there is a huge amount of work going on about just personal data. I co-lead the Secure Data Store Working Group at the working on encrypted vaults and hubs, encrypted data vaults and hubs. And there's also the community of My Data that's brought together 48 My Data operators. So I encourage you to also look at that work. And this is my concluding slide. Again, I'd like to invite all of you to join me and the whole community at the virtual IAW being hosted October 20th to 22nd. And if you want to get engaged on a day-to-day level, I recommend connecting with the Decentralized Identity Foundation and the W3C Credentials Community Group. Yes, their calls are early on Tuesday morning Pacific time, but they record all their calls and you can listen to them and participate on the mailing list and the GitHub. So with that, I'd love to and welcome any questions that you might have. This is my email address and my Twitter handle, and I look forward to answering your questions next. Thank you.
Uh, Hi, Kalia. I think we are back. He switched the stream.
Great.
So I want to give you a bunch of updates and essentially get your views on some of these before we have more questions from people. And if anyone has any questions, you can just ask the questions in the YouTube live chat box, and we're happy to ask. I'll be happy to ask Ali about them. So I think it's been a year that you were in India and you've carried out all of this. Okay, so there have been few developments over the year.
Yes, I imagine there have been. It has been a year. It was, yeah.
So so the Telangana system, the Andhra Pradesh system that you were studying with the state resident data hubs, have kind of evolved into something what the Indian government now terms as the India enterprise architecture or and the state enterprise architecture, adopting the whole idea of enterprise architecture from the IT sector. But what essentially happened in Telangana is we have a new digital ID, a state digital ID, and
Uh-huh.
it's based on facial recognition. But
Uh-oh.
the problem is it's just not that. The problem is nobody in the state knows that they have a new digital ID. There is no law. There is no government notification. Nobody, including the media, knows that there is a new digital ID. But we have already started using it at a large scale, and there have been pilots to use it in elections. So, yeah, that's one. The second thing is we are trying to get a new national health ID. I don't know if you heard about that.
I
So
haven't heard about that, but yeah.
yeah, so it's we have
They're
on.
trying to get one of those in the US too, by the way.
Yeah, so for immunity passports, right? Yes. So I think globally they're trying to push for a global identity network, at least, which can, especially with COVID, if you want people to travel, you
Yeah.
want to ensure that there are immunity passports. So yeah, so there are two new discussions that are emerging on digital IDs in India. One being a state digital ID, and this kind of emerged because of the entire data sharing. The state was
Right.
able to build it because they already had the data. They didn't have to go out and collect it further. So they just created a new digital ID and never told anybody that they've created one. Uh, then the health ID is again interesting. They wanted to use Aadhaar, but they couldn't because of the Supreme Court restrictions. So now they're creating a new ID, yet again without a law. So they kind of brought in new consultations for a policy instead of a law. Um so these are some of the updates on what's happening in India. But I have few questions from some of the people who have attended the talk.
Yeah.
Uh, One of the most important question that people ask when you compare US SSN with Aadhaar, right? They somehow feel, as you have mentioned during the talk, that because US is a mature democracy and SSN was relatively safe, so is Aadhaar. But Aadhaar
Right.
had these large-scale security incidents, uh, and when you're talking about the issue of trust, uh, how trusty is SSN versus how can you verify trust? Now, you did talk about these verifiable self-signed or signed by one of the verifying agencies for ID systems.
Yeah.
But this idea of trust is something that in machines is something humans really don't get it. So where is that gap when you compare, say, US and India?
Deep question, right? So there are security issues with the SSN, right? So part of the problem is that it is hard to check if someone actually belongs to their social security number. In fact, there's a whole set of private data brokers that provide services to businesses to help them check people's um, identity. So I think I'm not trying to paint a picture like our system works, but the comparison is inappropriate because the scope of the Aadhaar number and how people are thinking about using it is vastly different than what we have in the United States. And you were asked, I mean, and also trust is a complicated word. I mean, I'm happy to go into a discussion about it, but it needs to be a slightly narrower question, I think. I think there's different, like when people who think about computer systems talk about trust, they're often meaning cryptographic trust, like can I believe the mathematical signatures on the whatever to know whether it's valid or real or not. That doesn't solve the who issued you a document and should you believe anything that issuer issues. That is a sort of institutional trust or integrity of institution and business processes of those institutions. And that is a different, that isn't solved by math. It's solved through institutional processes and sort of the society wrapping around those institutions and to hold them accountable. There's another talk I have online that's specifically about these different levels of trust and sort of why we need to not mush them down into one word and talk about the type of trust that we're seeking to cultivate and which level of the trust in the trust kind of universe that you're trying to engage.
Okay, that's an important comparison, actually, right? The distinction between trust in systems, mathematical systems, or computing systems versus trust in institutions. Somehow they're clubbed, especially in India with Aadhaar, and which brings always the question of safety and privacy is like, then because you don't trust the institutions, you don't trust the system as well.
Right.
They're interlinked very deeply. So I have one question where, okay, there's one more question. Aadhaar has been criticized for surveillance implications. Are there any similar criticisms of SSN?
Right. So yes, I mean this is why and I didn't really fully even understand this because this all happened before I was born. So in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was a whole series of concerns about growing use of the SSN, both by many, many government agencies and by the private sector, and including proposals of building basically a national level data hub, right? And people got so concerned about these that those proposals not only were rejected but more laws, privacy laws, were put in place specifically to prohibit government agencies from sharing information about people. To the extent that things like when the U.S. government implemented our latest healthcare reforms, the Obamacare reforms, they had to write into law explicit circumstances where agencies could sort of touch each other enough to share enough data to get this new health system running. But it had to be written because otherwise it was prohibited from them sharing the data, sort of from the tax people who know how much you earn and the people who would know how much subsidy you got, that they could sort of touch enough to get some data about you moved between those two systems to allow you to get your healthcare, right? So there's very strong there was at the time this series of laws was passed, strong concerns about surveillance and the implications of the number being used in so many places. And so there's all of this structure that is sort of invisible and means that people are willing to use the number in the limited context that it is asked for, in part because they understand the protections that are in place to prevent those surveillance activities from really driving government behavior, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, it's important, I guess, people have realized the issue, because once you start pushing an ID system or using an ID system everywhere, I think the 70s or late 60s and the 70s was the peak FBI usage, and it was also the anti-war situation within the US, right? Like you
Right.
had the culture of defying the authority, where because everything the authority does is not necessarily for your good. I think we're witnessing some similarities of that in India right now. Hopefully we might get some sort of restrictions around our data sharing practices with our data protection law. But when you look at the US Privacy Act of 1974,
Yeah.
do you think it has restricted some of the concerns related to SSN? I mean, there are still
Yeah.
concerns because California is still trying to ask, some states are still trying to ask its agencies not to use SSN. Even with the restrictions, you see some level of concern.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that in that act, part of what it did, it said if you were already asking for the SSN, you can keep asking for it, right? But it also said things like if you don't, you have to tell people if they don't share their SSN, you won't deny them benefits. I don't know all the details of the law, but it's worth, sort of understanding what it says, because it's foundational to sort of addressing the concerns at the time that needed to be addressed so that people didn't freak out and like sort of stop using the system altogether, right? So that there was there's a clear lane for the SSN, and it's sort of kept in that lane by people who understand there is an administrative value for like knowing the next year when you pay your taxes that you are indeed the same person, right? But that doesn't mean that becomes the basis of how you prove who you are in all these other contexts.
So, so I want to ask you one last question. So it's increasingly becoming clear to us in India that what we are doing in India is like we're trying to copy Estonia, its X-road
Yes.
system, right?
Yes.
That's something that wasn't made clear to us when the Aadhaar system was announced. Okay, it was mostly compared with the SSN, and Estonia was never mentioned. But
Right.
now that these structures have emerged, it's very clear, and you do see in some of these government documents them trying to compare these state resident data hubs or enterprise architectures with Estonia's X-road system. In fact,
Right.
Telangana's new digital ID system actually, they're very proud that they built an X-road system like Estonia, but without informing people. Now, the key concern, yeah, the key concern though is in case of Estonia, you see that the accountability measures are baked into the system, right? Like
Yes.
people can check who has accessed their data, how the data flows across departments, across ministries, for example. That's something that's not there in India. But if you compare Estonia with, say, again, US and India, you compare all these three systems, not just SSN, but SSN, Estonia, and Aadhaar. Uh, where do you think there are key differences, if you have to
Yeah.
sum it up?
So Estonia is a former Soviet republic, or I don't know. It was in the Soviet Union, and it has 1.5 million people. It is incredibly tiny, and it had a computer programmer as its president, And they, when computer technology swept the world, they got on it and they built a digital infrastructure for their tiny little country that's mostly rural. And they built it in a way that was both from a systems level accountable, but they're in a society that is actively accountable to each other and incredibly small. And in a population of 1.5 million people, you sort of know everybody. There isn't like, because it's, you don't literally know everybody, but you are highly networked and have, a very few steps in all sectors of society. So there's really limited ability to be a bad actor and to get away with it if you want to function in your little tiny society. So it is okay for them to build the type of system that they built. It makes sense for their context. And what they said in building that system was that we're going to have different, healthcare stack for healthcare and the driver's license things and all the different services that you would find in a society. They're all going to have their own software, but we're going to make it so that when we ask a citizen for information about themselves in one context, that we will never ask them for that information in another context because they've already provided to us. Well, in order to make that vision a reality, you literally have to connect all of the databases up with each other and have a mechanism for people to sort of approve the data being pulled from one place to another. Again, this makes sense at the scale of country that they're operating in. 1.5 million people. As soon as you scale beyond the size of a small city, I don't think it's logistically possible to create that type of system and not have major security breaches and flaws and real risks to people having information move without their awareness or consent, to have all types of problems. And it definitely doesn't work at the scale of an Indian state of several hundred million people, and it does not work at the scale of the Indian continent as a whole of a billion people. There was a presentation that I saw at the EMA conference about people doing a prototype at the European level of this kind of Estonian model of like, well, if you gave data to any government within Europe once, wherever you're now interacting with should be able to pull the data over. And it was in a ridiculous architecture of crazy federated middleware. And it was like, I was like, that's never going to work. Like even within Europe, it's crazy to think about that type of system. Really, the only way to support the type of movement of data that people envision is to have the individual be the locus of the sharing, like the center of how the sharing happens. And that can be done with a combination of this new self-sovereign identity technology where whatever credentials or information I have from one institution is shared with me, and I can share it with another one if appropriate. And also with a combination of things like the personal data stores, encrypted data vaults where people are sort of collecting their own information in the cloud, potentially a cloud that they're controlling, but they're the locus of the connection, right? Not state databases talking to each other without people's awareness or consent.
I think the idea that it should be centered around the individual is important. It's quite easy for very digitally aware citizens to actually pull that off, right? When you create your own digital signatures.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the lack of digital literacy in the real world, I don't think it's pretty straightforward, potentially possible, but for a billion people, I'm still not so sure.
I back to one of the earlier questions about surveillance. I think I came away from my 2 months in India with really with the sense that Aadhaar had been the right system at a right system at the right time in the sort of arc of history of the development of India. And given the need to really support people with low literacy, low digital access from having this number and being able to interact with the state with it. Like, the fact that a national level government is issuing a number to people is not the problem. That happens all over Europe, in the United States, and Canada. Great. The question is, how do you use it? What is the digital life of it? And how are people empowered with it and you're not building a surveillance state? So another way I thought about it was if you took where Aadhaar is right now and you keep projecting it into the future, I think you get to a very scary place. And that's the conversation. And it's not dissimilar to where the United States was in the late 1960s, and people sort of projected the SSN and these proposals for these databases, and we're like, no, we don't want to go there. The question is, where do you go to get sort of like to an acceptable use for the number, but also an acceptable way to do the things that people imagine doing because of the number without the number being the center of all these things happening, right? And one way is to get towards these personal data stores and stuff. If you look at Kiva, which is an international nonprofit that does microloans, they're actually working with the government of Sierra Leone to set up custodial wallets for basically the entire population. And that, not maybe analogous to the DigiLockers, but the problem with DigiLockers is the government can see everything in those lockers, right? And maybe that's okay for now, but like, do you really want that in 50 years where all of their digital stuff is in lockers the government can nose around in? Probably not, right? Like, you got to keep the sort of future lens on and go, what do we want in the future without modifications? And that's where the engagement needs to happen. And I think you can get to a space where you imagine you have 95% literacy and digital accessibility everywhere in India. And then how do you want it to look? It's probably different than now, right?
I think that's an important way to look at it, right? Like you will have digital systems, and there is no stopping them. It's, I guess, how information societies progress. It's just that how accountable you want these systems to exist. I think as a society, we will debate this, hopefully, and our institutions. But with COVID, I'm not sure how and when it's going to happen. But if one thing that COVID has made everyone aware is that it's potential for surveillance because everything's digitized. And thank you, Kalia, for doing this talk and answering questions. And I'm hoping a lot of people who have listened to this talk will attend your workshop in October. And I definitely will attend the workshop. And I would love to see your book coming out, and hopefully you to look at the emerging architectures in India at some point in future.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to also work with someone maybe on the value network maps that got started but never actually got really fully finished or published. But I think they're a good way. Actually, we could build maps of the Estonia system, and like, it's a way to look at these systems and understand how they work that gets out of like technical architecture diagrams and prose, which I don't think are enough to really explain these systems. But it was a real pleasure talking with you, and sort of hard to say hi to all the virtual people, but I believe they're there. And you can reach out to me on Twitter or via the email that was in the talk. And yeah, I'm happy to help folks connect to any of the identity things that were mentioned and the SSI community in particular.
Thank you, Kalia. If anyone wants to reach Kalia, you should just reach out to her at @identitywoman, or you can just check her website out, identitywoman.net. On that note, we will end the talk.
Thank you.